introduce Patrick Jordan and Kathleen DeSutter Jordan. They met one another at the New York Catholic Worker in 1969. And the rest, they say, is history. I'm thinking in particular of an image of their two beautiful grandchildren, so it all worked out very well. Pat had arrived the year before. Both of them have served terms as editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper, and they were there for many, many, many years during the era of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights movements, and very significant times in our history. And they, of course, were there for many years to come and remain very integral members of that community. Pat was a draft resistor during the Vietnam War, and in an extremely unusual situation, was sentenced to fill out his punishment by serving volunteer hours at the Catholic Worker. He said his parole officer nearly tore his hair out. Pat went on later to serve many years as managing editor of Commonweal magazine. He is the author of the 2 books on Dorothy that we have mentioned and that we have on sale in the back, as well as editing many collections of Dorothy's works, writing numerous articles, and traveling throughout the country as part of Commonweal's Speakers Bureau, and speaking on Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. Kathleen came to the Catholic Worker from the Midwest, where she had a strong bond with the Sisters of Loretto, who taught her from kindergarten through college. They have been her teachers from kindergarten through college, and she says to this day. In addition, she has written several articles and spoken in a variety of settings about Dorothy. I well remember the inspiring homily she gave at the Mass for the 50th anniversary of the Catholic Worker in 1983. As I was leaving the Mass, a woman walking next to me said, "Now there's the best argument I've heard yet for the ordination of women." Kathleen is a registered nurse and has worked for many years in healthcare settings, particularly with people with developmental disabilities. But as a close friend said to me, perhaps the most important thing to say about them is how much Dorothy cherished their friendship. She said many times how much joy their love and their love of beauty brought to her. And as Dorothy became aged and more frail, they played a major role in caring for her in her cottage on Staten Island. You saw that simple cottage out there. Pat and Kathleen lived right there, and really were a great presence to her. So, welcome.
Thank you, Margie. You can see why our children and grandchildren call Marge Aunt Margie. How honored we are to be here with you today at Maryknoll, and on such an anniversary, the 30th anniversary of the November 16th martyrs of El Salvador. We are indeed surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, those who have gone before us, those here among us. Pat and I each had the privilege to have been able to visit El Salvador, he in 1989, I in 1990. The occasion for my visit was the celebration of Sister Anne Manganero's 25th anniversary as a Sister of Loretto. At the time, Anne was working with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps as a physician in Chalatenango, the same province where Sisters Ida and Mora had worked before they were martyred, and where they are buried. We visited a church in San Salvador, St. Francis of Assisi, which had been the home parish of Father Octavio Ortiz. He had been the first priest to be ordained by then Archbishop, now Saint, Oscar Romero. Etched in the stone of the church's floor, on either side of the altar, were these 2 questions, in Spanish, of course. What does it mean to be salt for the earth? What does it mean to be light for the world? These 2 phrases had been the opening questions that Father Ortiz had prepared for a weekend leadership retreat for young Salvadorans he was giving in early 1979. On the morning of January 20th, he and 4 of the youths attending the retreat were brutally murdered by Salvadoran security forces at El Despertar, the retreat center in San Salvador. And so it is these very questions are addressed to us this day, every day. What does it mean to be salt for the earth? What does it mean to be a light for the world? Such weighty, demanding questions and images. Pat and I were asked to share some of our memories and impressions of Dorothy Day over the years we lived and worked with her, from 1968 to 1975 and 1977 to 80, and to reflect on where these might challenge and lead us today. On occasions such as this, being fairly nervous, I found it somewhat helpful to ask myself, what are a few things about Dorothy that I might not have known or understood had I not known and loved and worked with her? I was struck by a similar view in a memoir I recently read that had been written in the early 1950s by a young woman, Helen Caldwell Day, later Helen Caldwell Riley, who had come to New York City from the South to study nursing. A priest she had confided in concerning her own intense search for faith and crippling self-doubts had suggested she visit the Catholic Worker down on in lower Manhattan. It didn't take long for Helen to feel right at home. As she wrote in her book, Color Ebony, soon they, the Catholic workers, let me do odd jobs around the worker, things that everybody else was too busy to do, or which freed someone for something more important that I could not do. Sometimes I kept the clothes room for Irene, or answered letters. Sometimes I helped John Paul, one of the men who lived there, clean up the office. A bit later, Helen reflects on how inspiring it was simply living with Dorothy, hearing her speak, and seeing how she put what she said into action. That's something, Helen went on, you don't quite get, usually, from just hearing her lecture or reading what she says. There was a warmness about her, a tenderness. Woman, mother. So I hope to share briefly at least a flavor, a glimpse of what I experienced of the dailiness of grace in the years I was graced to know Dorothy. How beautiful Dorothy was, even as an older woman, which she was when I knew her. Perhaps I'm a bit prejudiced, as I'm now an older woman, close to the age Dorothy was when I first came to the Catholic Worker 50 years ago. And she appreciated beauty in all its forms. A simple wheat design on a dinner plate, the Queen Anne's lace and blue sailors or chicory lining Staten Island roadsides, rocks and seashells along the beach. Nearing the end and no longer able to make the trip from the city to Spanish Camp on Staten Island, Dorothy often would ask us to pick up a white stone for me on the beach. Every time I wore a simple blouse my mother had given me with a patchwork quilt-like pattern, Dorothy never failed to compliment it. Mm-hmm. While she did wear clothes that had been donated to the clothing room, Dorothy also greatly appreciated handmade dresses and skirts made by her friend Mary Humphreys, and undergarments sent faithfully by her sister Della. A good book, whether Austen, Bellow, or Tolstoy, Chekhov, or a good Dorothy Sayers mystery, and opera couldn't be beat. Only recently, well aware of Dorothy's love for both the Psalms and opera, I found myself often coming across lines in the Psalms that were replete with the passion, the sorrow, and the ecstasy of opera. Can't you hear strains of Tosca in lines such as these from the Psalms? I am wretched, close to death from my youth. I have borne your trials, I am numb. Your faithful love to me has been great. You saved me from the depths of Sheol. A band of the ruthless seeks my life. To you they pay no heed. Or perhaps a melody from La Boheme or Traviata with lines such as, my heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Like the deer that yearns for running streams, so my soul is yearning for you, my God. In you do our hearts find joy. Dorothy was firm but sweet. One night at supper, the carrots looked particularly scraggly. The person who had prepared supper argued that they were more nutritious unpeeled. While that may or may not be true, Dorothy recognized the real reason they hadn't been peeled on that occasion, laziness, which was acknowledged and didn't happen soon again. Several of us were up in Dorothy's room as she was opening the morning mail when a note and check came in, addressed to her personally, and insisting she enjoy some wine and roses. In but a matter of seconds, she looked at Pat and me and announced so cheerfully, I know just what I'm going to do with this. Take you to see Fiddler on the Roof. And so she did, treating us on the way at a chock full of nuts to a cream cheese sandwich and cup of coffee. I had walked home with Dorothy from evening mass at Nativity. It happened to be the 40th anniversary of the Catholic worker, and a festive supper had been prepared. However, as the first of the month, it was also a time when some would receive whatever checks were coming to them and go right out and celebrate with a beer, or two, or six. Thus it was, on entering the dining room, we were met with a scene of absolute chaos. Dorothy somewhat slumped against me. She walked with a cane then, and uttered quietly, desperately, what have I done? She was unable to enter any further into the dining room, and instead went upstairs to her bedroom for the night. We'd just entered her room when she turned, looked me straight in the eye, and said quite adamantly, don't pity me. I wasn't sure then, or now, what precisely I had communicated to evoke such a clear admonition from her, but it certainly left an impression. She took utter delight in watching our daughter Hannah as a toddler climb all over her kitchen table and chairs, and later in holding our son Justin as an infant. I'll take care of the child, so just call me, she'd say with her good night each evening as the term of my pregnancy drew near. On the other hand, flesh and blood. Dorothy could be impatient and even judgmental. She seemed to generally catch herself fairly quickly and to apologize if needed. We were talking on the phone, she in her room at Mary House, I home in Spanish camp, and I must have asked how she was doing. Well, Stanley's here. Stanley had been at the Catholic worker just about as long as Dorothy. Stanley's here, and he's taking up all the oxygen. Fortunately, Dorothy had a pretty good sense of humor, subtle, not uproarious. Shortly before her final illness, she was attending a Friday night meeting at Mary House, where several people in the community were discussing a civil disobedience action planned to take place the next day at the UN. Dorothy turned around and said quietly to people sitting nearby, I'd like to go up myself, but I'm afraid that when an officer would come and ask why I was refusing to stand up, I might have forgotten the reason. One day, Pat and a few others had gone up to Bellevue to donate blood, but they weren't accepted because their hemoglobin was too low. That night at supper, a bottle of Geritol appeared mysteriously at each of their places. One evening, a particularly challenging and verbose member of the household made it clear he wanted to sit next to Dorothy at the supper table that night. "Put him on my right side," Dorothy instructed. Her hearing was worse on her right side. I was sitting next to her on the desk in the soup kitchen one morning as Dorothy was opening the day's mail. One letter brought an announcement from a university that they were bestowing on her at graduation their most prestigious award. Without missing a beat, she lowered her head and said quietly and sincerely, "What are we doing wrong?" In one of the prefaces of saints, we pray, "By their way of life, you offer us an example. By communion with them, you give us companionship." A few weeks after Pat and I had left New York and the worker in the winter of 1975, with a fairly unknown path ahead of us, we were bolstered by a letter from Dorothy. She acknowledged the weariness we must have experienced from our time at the worker and recommended, as we traversed the country via Greyhound, that we rest your eyes from reading, too. Look off into the distances and wait for the Lord. You see, I am very much with you. We all love you so much, miss you so much, but feel you are here with us just the same. Such friendships the Lord has sent us in this life. God is good. We can't thank him enough. Thank you, Lord, for everything, but friendships especially. We are not alone. In a recent book review of the eminent biblical scholar Robert Alter's The Art of Biblical Translation, Sarah Rutan, herself a poet, scholar, and translator, admits to wondering whether American civilization right now actually could foster anything in the spirit of the original Bible. We are utterly unlike defeated Judah under the weird saving sponsorship of the Persians, and even more unlike the early Christians in the shadow, whether sheltering or threatening, of the Roman monolith. We are an absurdly successful, materialistic, late imperial society with bright, pixelated luxuries of individual autonomy and self-esteem. How could we think the way the Bible does, or aim where it aims? In particular, what would motivate us to throw ourselves into the arms of an immense otherness and act at the heart of both monotheism and supreme artistic creation? On reading that, I found myself thinking of Dorothy. She did that. She had absolutely no illusions whatsoever about the flotsam and jetsam of our absurdly successful, materialistic, late imperial society, nor of her own failings and need for forgiveness. In fact, her dailiness of grace presents an extraordinary and compelling example of her own art of biblical translation and nurtures our hope. In conclusion, I'd like to share two personal experiences, revelations as it were, that hopefully will convey to you something of the grace of Dorothy's life and of her friendship and of her undivided heart. I must digress here briefly, knowing that Kate and those of you fortunate to have read her fine memoir of her grandmother and her mother might question my use of the phrase, an undivided heart. I believe this was true of Dorothy from the moment she met Peter Morin and they began the Catholic Worker. One evening, again after having walked with Dorothy up to her room, she turned to me, looking me right in the eye again, and said, "I never looked back." Forgive me, as I must forgive myself, for not recalling precisely what had preceded that, but I knew on the spot what she clearly meant had to do with her own vocation. Now for those two personal experiences. One evening, when I had been especially upset by the tone and emphasis of a letter from the Cardinal read that day from the pulpit, condemning anyone who had anything whatsoever to do with an abortion. This was pre-Roe versus Wade, but post-abortion, having been legalized in New York State. I'd gone up to Dorothy's room to talk with her about it, more like to vent about it, as I was quite critical of the Cardinal's letter. Dorothy listened quietly and attentively, and then she responded, "These are not the worst times in the history of the church. We have to have the long view, like our communist brothers and sisters." An hour or two later, I returned to her room and found her seated next to her bed in her nightgown with her Bible open on her lap. "I was just thinking of you when I came across this," she said, and continued, reading from Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart." I am still chagrined, if not downright embarrassed, to admit that, while knowing that familiar and great text, I found myself thinking, as I said goodnight and started walking downstairs, I wonder why she read that. What does that have to do with abortion or my agitation? And then, oh, very literally, like a ton of bricks, it hit me that what Dorothy had read to me, the great Shema, is the very heart of the matter. Thank God, eventually the penny drops. A year or two later, Pat and I were living away from the New York Catholic worker, working with longtime Catholic workers with whom we had experienced some real conflict and painful disappointment. That evening we called Dorothy to ask for her prayers. The next morning when the phone rang, we were quite surprised and very happy to hear her voice. "I was doing my morning reading just now," she said, "and thought of you when I came across this passage. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress, or persecution or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." And then Dorothy added, "Think of Julian of Norwich. All will work out. Consoling then, consoling still." So often I've thought of Dorothy with the beautiful readings from the Book of Wisdom this week. "And wisdom, who is one, can do all things, and passing into holy souls from age to age, she produces friends of God and prophets." Several masterpieces by the 15th century Italian painter Giovanni da Paolo are included in the holdings of the Metropolitan Museum, but a few miles down the road. There's something both timely yet futuristic in his brilliantly colorful, dynamic panel, The Creation of the World and the Expulsion from Paradise, as if he had consulted not only Dante, but Teilhard de Chardin. In another gallery, one finds another De Paolo painting, Paradise. It originally formed part of the base of an altarpiece that included the Creation and Expulsion panel. I never tire of the joy of seeing its groups of angels and saints greeting and embracing one another, almost dancing, in an exquisitely beautiful and redeemed garden. In memory of Dorothy, and with gratitude for the salt and light of Maryknoll, I'd like to conclude with a short, lovely poem by Samuel Monash. Paradise after Giovanni da Paolo. Paradise is a grove where flower and fruit tree form oval petals and pears, and apples only fair. Among these saunter saints, who uphold one another in sacred conversations, shaping hands that come close as the lilies at their knees, while seraphim burn with the moment's breeze. Thank you.
Thank you for having us all here at Maryknoll today to talk about Dorothy and the dailiness of grace. Dorothy had a great affection for Maryknoll and for Maryknollers. There's a wonderful photo of her here in one of the porticos. I guess it would have been in the 1930s. And she was ever grateful for the assistance that Maryknoll sent routinely to the worker house on Mott Street in the 30s, both food and clothing. And she said it was a Maryknoll sister who really got the first Los Angeles Catholic worker house going. That was around 1937. Dorothy had great esteem for Father Donald Hessler and his work in China and Latin America. And she visited him in Mexico. And I think she may have come here for his ordination in 39. She was also delighted in the 1970s when several Maryknoll sisters from the cloister came to live and pray in a small apartment on the Lower East Side. And she would be delighted today that the driving force behind this gathering is Marge Humphrey, who first heard Dorothy speak at the 1976 Eucharistic Conference in Philadelphia, and was so inspired that she came to live at the Catholic Worker before becoming a physician assistant and joining the Maryknoll Lay Missioners. All is grace. As is this place, one of sending forth missionaries all over the earth with the good news, in season and out, from generation to generation. Kathleen mentioned Dorothy's love of the Psalms. Dorothy said that she was reinvigorated each morning with her cup of coffee and the Psalms. One of them, Psalm 93, puts things so succinctly and eloquently. Holiness befits your house, O God, for length of days. And that's why we are here today, talking about Dorothy and what she can teach us, bread for the journey. We have all met holiness in our lives. Over the years, I've known and worked with a number of, if not saints, certainly saintly people. Yet for me, Dorothy stands in a league of her own. Not only was hers a singular holiness, but it was a radical holiness. Not only in terms of its vision and outreach, but in terms of its challenge to her times and place, and to ours. You have already caught a glimpse of that in what our speakers have shared, and there will be more to come this afternoon, culminating in the liturgy. Bob Hoyt, the founding editor of the National Catholic Reporter, used to ask me at Commonweal, where we both worked as editors, about Dorothy. He had met her in Rome during the Second Vatican Council, and it was clear that he held her in the highest esteem. There was something special about her, Bob implied. And as Dorothy herself wrote of Larry Heaney, a young Catholic worker and father who had died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1949, we all of us have always been convinced that sanctity is the only thing in the world worth striving for. the only quality which is of any value whatsoever to God, to us, or to the world. In her 1948 book on pilgrimage, she noted, naturally speaking, people are filled with repulsiveness at the idea of holiness. We have so many examples of Pecksniffs in our midst. But then she went on, now we are filled with encouragement. Writers like Ignazio Saloni in his Bread and Wine are crying aloud for a synthesis, the saint revolutionist who would impel others to holiness by his or her example. A little later in the same book on pilgrimage, Dorothy writes, we have seldom been given the saints as they really were, as they affected the lives of their times. We get them generally, really get them only in their own writings. And we owe here such a great debt to Robert Ellsberg as regards to Dorothy in this manner. But Dorothy continued, instead of the strong meat, we are too generally given the pap of hagiographical writing. Too little has been stressed the idea that all are called. Too little attention has been placed on the idea of mass conversions. We, she writes, have sinned against the virtue of hope. There has been in these days, it was 1948, mass conversions to Nazism, fascism, and communism. Where are our saints, she asked, to call the masses to God? And then she concluded, personalist first, we must put the question to ourselves. Communitarians, we will find Christ in our brothers and sisters. A few years later, in her book Loaves and Fishes, 1963, Dorothy writes, the greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution that has to start with each of us. Paramount in understanding Dorothy Day is that she was a working journalist with a point of view. Hearing her type was to have a sense of the ferocious. The movable carriage of her Underwood simply banged to the end, only to be flung back and spun again. I got to work with Dorothy for about 6 years on the paper, and for me it was a fully subsidized postgraduate work-study scholarship. Look at the volume of her work. She wrote and published nearly nonstop from her teens to her mid-70s, and often in the most dire of circumstances, the bedlam of the Catholic worker farms and communities, described so evocatively in her lament to Kathleen that 40th anniversary evening, What Have I Done? I first met Dorothy at St. Joseph House on 1st Street in 1968. The house was still under renovation. She was sitting on the first floor, waiting for a contractor prior to the house being certified for occupancy. Dorothy was talking with 2 young draft resistors. She welcomed me. She made you feel right at home, at ease, and she spoke with you on the same level. And we discussed mutual friends. And then she put me right to work, told me where to go to put my bag, and from there, how to get to the Christie Street house to help with supper. Dorothy was always encouraging others. Robert, Marge, Kathleen, and me, among them. She would give you assignments. When I was helping edit the paper, she sent me off to union halls to interview E.F. Schumacher in Vermont, and asked me to attend Jenny Moore's funeral with her in Washington. She told me to be sure that each issue of the paper dealt with racism, the farm workers, prisoners, war and poverty, and of course, the primacy of the spiritual that underlay them all. When Kathleen and I returned to New York in 1977 and I was looking for a paying job, by then we had 2 young children, she told me on separate occasions to go to Commonweal. I would never have had the temerity to do so had it not been for her. And her advice led to the longest segment of my life's work and employment. Yes, as Kathleen noted, Dorothy was beautiful. In Kate, you will see reflected that family resemblance and beauty. Still, I was totally flummoxed when a photographer said to me one day I was taking him up to Dorothy's room where he was going to photograph her. "Wouldn't you love to make love to her?" Honestly, the idea had never occurred to me. But I could see what moved him. And later, some of his pictures were singular and wonderful. They caught her loveliness, her directness, her joy. See the front piece of Robert's collection, By Little and by Little, the writings of Dorothy Day. One of my favorite Bob Fitch photographs of Dorothy is of her at prayer at evening mass at Nativity Church. I put a copy up here under the statue of the Madonna. It was in the movie that we saw before, this image. I happened to be there when this was happening and found myself somewhat distracted by the photographer's peripatetic intrusiveness and insistence. None of that seemed to distract Dorothy, however. For her, it was as if the photographer was not there. But what Fitch managed to catch was some of the depth and attentiveness of Dorothy at prayer. And I think for me, that's what I remember most of Dorothy. Dorothy had lists of people and causes that she was praying for. You'd find them in her prayer books. But what is so striking about her writing on prayer is how she always went to the heart of the matter. For example, in All Is Grace, she avers, "I would not dare to write or speak or follow the vocation God has given me to work for the poor and for peace if I did not have this constant reassurance of the Mass." And she adds, "The Mass is the most important thing we do." When speaking to young volunteers at the worker, she even called the Mass an obligation, a duty, quote, "to come together in community to praise, honor, worship, thank the good Lord, and to beg strength to continue the daily round, bear the daily sufferings of our human condition." We can do nothing without prayer, she says. We go backwards when we stop praying. We must pray as regularly as we eat in order to grow. The dailiness of grace. As Kathleen noted, Dorothy loved to read. In a book on Charles David called, she underlined a letter he had written to his sister in which he insisted there must be no economizing on good books. And she told readers in 1947, "I recommend fiction because it has helped me so much." She wrote to Thomas Merton that she considered Dostoevsky spiritual reading. Another of the great novelists she recommended to me was Sigrid Undset, the Norwegian Nobel Prize winner. Her novels, The Master of Hestvigen and Kristin Lavransdatter, are epic sagas of 13th century Catholic Norway. Dorothy told me she thought The Master of Hestvigen was the superior of the two, in part, I think, because of its sustained spiritual depth. Bracing, challenging, heartbreaking, replete throughout with history and the drama of real life. The author Anne Fremantle once wrote that Dorothy, whom she knew personally, was the most unsentimental of saints. Concerning Unset, Dorothy told me that when Unset visited the Mott Street house, not long after the Nazis forced her to flee her homeland, Unset told Dorothy she had been lecturing on one of Dorothy's books the week before the Germans invaded. Dorothy loved to share, as in give away, good books. She gave us, for example, a 4-volume set of George Orwell's collected essays, journals, and letters. And she gave us Edmund Wilson's The Bit Between My Teeth, a literary chronicle of the 1950s up to 65. And that was a gift from Dwight MacDonald. The stamp is on the book on the inner cover. Several marvelous essays, which Dorothy pointed out, were about Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, where Wilson remarks, the large theme of Dr. Zhivago is death and resurrection. A line that Dorothy, that's why she wanted to refer us to. Knowing Kathleen and my needs, perhaps, she always seemed to be giving us prayer books and various translations of this Bible. We have and still use a well-worn copy of John L. Mackenzie's Dictionary of the Bible. And we have C.S. Lewis's Reflections on the Psalms. For Pat and Kathleen, the inscription begins, I got so much from this C.S. Lewis, I must share this second copy with you that I have. With love, Dorothy. Dorothy highly recommended Lewis's autobiographical Surprised by Joy as well. For her, joy was so much the heart of the matter. Why trifle with mere pursuit of happiness? As Tamar told Rosalie Regal, Dorothy had a wonderful laugh and a sense of humor, just joyfulness. She always pointed out that the saints are joyful. And as she told Kathleen and me, you will know your vocation by the joy that it brings you. Of course, it certainly wasn't and isn't always joyful around the Catholic worker. We used to joke that St. Joseph's house wasn't a house of hospitality, but a house of hostility. Besides never-ending physical work, there were the frequent episodes of high drama and the imminent threat of violence. A knife at one's throat or in the back, being thrown across the kitchen table by an irate member of the soup line, being choked into unconsciousness on the doorstep while barring a threatening addict from entry. Dorothy saw all this, and she came to understand the Catholic worker as a school of nonviolence, a critical learning experience for many young people in their search for a vocation. She wrote in 1975, for example, and Robert already quoted from this a bit, that young people who came to the worker learn not only to love with compassion, but to overcome fear, that dangerous emotion that precipitates violence. They may go on feeling fear, but they know the means. They have grown in faith to overcome it. And then she said, Lord, deliver us from the fear of our enemies. Kathleen has mentioned some of the personal experiences we had with Dorothy, her love and care for us, her sadness when we moved on and found vocations outside the worker proper, and I think her disappointment when that happened. For despite the beautiful postscript in The Long Loneliness, which ends with her sense of community, culminating in her phrase, "We are no longer alone," I still sense that Dorothy remains singular and alone until the end. She was a single mother, and following Peter Morin's death, she was the lone remaining founder, the undisputed leader on whom rested all the pressing and defining decisions. It was Dorothy who wrote the appeals, traveled endlessly, edited the paper, all the while painfully aware of her personal shortcomings and failures, and those of the rest of us. If I had to pick one emblematic event while I was at the worker that conveyed Dorothy's singularity, courage, and solitary leadership, it would have to be the tax case of 1972. In a nutshell, the government under the Nixon administration threatens to shut down the worker for not paying back income taxes. But of course, the worker never paid taxes on income for the simple reason that no one gets paid at the Catholic worker. Voluntary poverty is an essential part of the deal, the worker's bottom line. And if you are going to live with the poor, you had better become poor yourself. When the crisis hit, Dorothy simply went among the various members of the community responsible for the daily functioning of things, sounding out their thoughts about what to do. I had a sense early on, however, that she had already decided on a likely course of action. The worker would not cooperate with the government. And should the government liquidate the worker entirely, houses, farm, and the newspaper, the workers themselves would simply regroup, form small, self-sustaining communities in neighborhood apartments, begin publishing another paper or handout, and carry on the works of mercy daily. In all this, there was this tremendous freedom on Dorothy's part, a joyfulness even, and a youthfulness. She was nearly 75 at the time. As Psalm 92 says, the upright will flourish like the palm tree. In old age, they will still bear fruit, remain fresh and green to proclaim God's integrity. Several years later, in the spring of 1975, she wrote self-reflectively, "And here I am, trying to grow in the life of the Spirit. I feel I am but a beginner." I remember attending a meeting at the time of the tax crisis with a senior government official up from Washington, during which Dorothy put forward the Catholic worker position. She was both beautiful and charming that day, but she was also firm and resolute in her defense of the work and the witness of the Catholic worker. And apparently, she was also convincing. For after some very bad publicity in the local and the national media, the government simply and quietly dropped the case. Meanwhile, at the worker, life went on as usual, sending out the paper, welcoming the harborless, feeding the hungry, demonstrating against militarism and materialism, clothing the naked, and praying the Psalms. In his 1987 book, Tranquilitas Ordinis, A Defense of the Just War Theory, George Weigel, Dorothy's sometime critic, wrote that to her pacifism, Dorothy added a commitment to nonviolent resistance and social change. Worker pacifism, Weigel continued, was not a species of quietism. It demanded an activist stance toward the principalities and powers of this world. And then Weigel concluded, the witness of Dorothy Day and of the Catholic worker movement in its self-giving love and radical commitment to the corporal and spiritual works of mercy sets a standard against which American Catholics might measure their own lives. The enduring truth of Dorothy Day's life rests in her faith that all is grace. There's so much more to say about Dorothy, and fortunately we have Kate and others to do that later this afternoon. But for now, if you would permit me, following Kathleen's wonderful lead, I would like to read a short poem. I think it is one that might have appealed to Dorothy, for it is based on a biblical understanding of God's infinite otherness and beauty, as reflected sacramentally in nature and invoked in the Shema of the Hebrew Scriptures. Heaven is when we see God face to face, Dorothy wrote in her diary in 1940, when we shall see him as he is. Now is only a glimpse, a suggestion of light, of joy, of unity, of completion. Psalm 150 ends with the arresting and commanding line, "Let everything that lives and that breathes give praise to God." Dorothy Day lived that. So here now is the poem. It's called Saura, which is Gaelic for summer, and is written in the style of an ancient Irish I Am ballad by a contemporary Midwestern poet, Kimberly Schneider. You might wish to close your eyes or look out the windows here as you listen to it. Let everything that lives and that breathes give praise to God. Saura. I am the smile of the lover. I am the infant at the breast. I am the beckoning horizon. I call the fledgling from the nest. I am the sweetness of the berry. I am the alchemy of yeast. I am desire and consummation. I am the music at the feast. I am the light that shines in darkness. I am the wisdom born of pain. I am the power of transformation. I am the everlasting flame. I am the flower of compassion. I am spirit come to earth. I am the healing of all that is broken. I am effervescent mirth.